I have watched every single Barbie movie ever released. Okay, I was so excited for the Barbie movie that I ended up just watching all 42 animated Barbie movies for a total of 43 Barbie movies between July and August. And I regret nothing. I feel like it's such an easy thing to sit here and make a joke about how I tortured myself by doing this, or that it was agonizing and miserable, because I think a lot of people just expect these calculator looking movies, direct to home children movies nonetheless, to be dreadful. But they're not. Like, these are genuinely very good movies. Some of them are actually excellent. And I don't want to set the mood with even joking negatively when I feel like there's a lot of positive and interesting things to say about them. Let's jump to the beginning of this entire undergoing. In a Games as Culture seminar class that I took last semester, we briefly discussed the concept of girl games, particularly in a market saturated with games targeting male audiences. Generally, I dislike the term girl games as a form of categorization, as it implies that femininity and masculinity in media need to fit into a rigid binary, which really doesn't make much sense at all. The idea of a girl game implies the idea of a boy game, which logically doesn't really fit into our cultural perception of games. The label then separates girls from games, more so than it reinforces the bridge between the two. The idea of a girl game also implies that the way of achieving equity within the industry is to make a sufficiently comparable amount of games for men and games for women, or as the label suggests, games for men and games for girls. However, this ignores that the real goal of equity in game design is simple: to make games that any audience can engage with, regardless of their gender. The general consensus of this discussion is that it's not hard to see how games became so stereotypically masculine. Feminine activities have often been seen as mundane, from housekeeping to cooking or cleaning, whereas male activities were more, well, active, from sports to war or heroics. So, from an inequitable culture, male-centric design seems far more appealing in the games industry. In reflecting on this, I wrote the following passage. The gendering of individual activities within culture has been reflected within video games, which has fostered inequity and effectively reinforced those problematic cultural stereotypes. As Braithwaite explains, boys' culture, rooted in outdoor adventure and exploration, emphasized autonomy, mastery, aggression, and individualism to produce young men ready to tackle the public sphere. Girls' culture, meanwhile, relegated girls to domesticity, indoor spaces in which girls were encouraged to hone the skills that would help them help others. Naturally, the former of these tasks is far more compelling than the latter, leading developers to pivot towards stereotypically masculine activities and the creation of game narratives and characters. As games represented culturally masculine activities, games were designed and marketed for boys, leading women to be seen as secondary to men within the video game industry, and by extension, within media and culture itself. While girls could still engage with stereotypically masculine mechanics, the male-centric marketing for masculine audiences relegated women to inferior roles within games. By servicing a male audience, the lesser interests of girls in video games was an inherent product of cultural misogyny. The hyper-masculine nature of games and the focus on male characters made games less appealing to non-male audiences. Due to the artificial generated masculine play space, backlash against misogyny and sexism was insignificant. For players outside these masculine identities, these games were not fantastical escapes, but rather echo chambers of cultural misogyny found outside the game. In Playing with Pride, Karen Skardzius discusses the consequences of misogynistic social cultures within games. It is reasonable to assume that being required to submit frequent reports to Blizzard Entertainment in order to police other players would erode the supposedly fun experience the player is supposed to be having. Video games have often mirrored problematic aspects of Western society, but they don't have to. Through a rejection of intolerance and inequality, games can become a more culturally inclusive space, which may increase inclusivity within the broader culture as well. So, through a poor and misogynistic reflection of social culture, games reinforce sexist concepts and ideals. Ironically, then, as a result of this inequity, an audience has been generated for games targeting a particularly feminine audience, which is, to be clear, a good thing. Because the fact is, despite the masculine focus of many games, women and girls still play. So by creating feminine-focused games, an untapped audience in the video game market is reached, which can help reinforce and legitimize the existence of women as game players. It's sort of an interesting point to reach, since the existence of women as game players has been an obvious constant, and something that always should have been considered. It's frustrating having to legitimize an audience that has already been legitimate for the entire existence of the industry. Toxic misogyny in culture has failed to not only treat women equitably, but to recognize women at all. So, in class, we discussed Nancy Drew and how similar games targeted an audience of women. These games created this clear expectation that the game is predominantly and directly for women. Through this, games could target an undervalued audience and made it clear that that audience is not a secondary thought, but a primary core, the purpose by which the game exists. This audience, then, is marketed to through a heavy focus on expected femininity in culture, from female protagonists to vibrance, bright worlds. Not only were these games very clearly made by women for an audience of women, but the game visually reinforces imagery commonly associated with femininity, doing this to reinforce the independent attempt to design for that specific audience. This idea is sort of radical, that a stereotype of imagery can be used to immediately describe the intent of the game, reclaiming, in a way, that stereotype, turning it into something empowering, symbolic of the audience for which it's designed. Among the discussed games was Barbie Fashion Designer, which Braithwaite communicates as something that not only was pitched for girls, but explicitly pitched as not for boys. To be clear, this does not negate the idea that boys could play a feminine game, but rather emphasizes the role of boys in the audience. Rather than being the primary audience, boys were a secondary audience, because the game was not for them. It was for girls. Certainly, one audience can still engage with something that's not for them, if only they understand their role in that audience as a secondary member of the audience. This sort of marketing sets a clear boundary, something that cannot be falsely claimed as part of masculine media. From this, a friend of mine discussed the Barbie movies, mentioning that not only were they inherently feminine media, but media that was successful in communicating with the audience and creating an engaging watching experience. These movies, then, function as a reflection of feminine media that, in targeting a female audience, reclaims feminine imagery that was used to other those female audiences and create a divide between male and female media. And it was clear that Greta Gerwig's Barbie movie was going to similarly reclaim that hyper-feminine imagery as a social point where the idea of inclusivity was blending femininity into masculinity to create diverse spaces. Barbie was overt in its femininity, an excess of femininity, paving this new view of inclusivity that creates a greater space for gendered individuality. And so, before going to see the new Barbie movie, I asked my friend which animated Barbie movies I should watch. I expected the movies to be good after all that discussion, but when I finished watching The Princess and the Pauper, I was blown away. The Princess and the Pauper is an incredible movie, something that easily could have been categorized with classic Disney stories had it come at a different time with a more visually pleasing animation. But beyond that, the writing was sharp, the story was well conceived, the movie was engaging and exciting in a way that I couldn't have anticipated. And so I watched a few more that were recommended to me. While the Fairytopia trilogy felt a bit weaker in comparison to other movies, I drew something out of each of them that I really loved, particularly the message of fighting for the friends you haven't met yet. These movies quickly proved to be successful children's media, one that does not consider the need to be dumbed down or weakened in order to engage a younger audience. It's so common that children's media often presents without intentionality or substantial efforts, but Barbie functions counter to that. And not only does Barbie work effectively as media targeting a female audience, it's media that is presented with a unique amount of care and thought. I won't be reviewing all the Barbie movies here because I already did that on my Letterboxd account, which can be accessed in the description of this video. But I do think it's interesting to explore the eras of the Barbie movies, from the fantasy era Barbie reimaginings to the modern day movies with actor Barbie, to Barbie and her sisters in that era, to the most modern era that also feels very detached from the previous films. The first era of Barbie movies takes place with Barbie as an actor playing a role in a fantasy film often derived from fairy tales, so the movie themselves becomes the film that Barbie is acting in. This era felt the most creatively free, with Barbie playing a vastly different character in each movie, often alongside a new animal companion. The following eras begin with actor Barbie quitting while producing another of the original run of Barbie movies. The story then shifts to following Barbie as an actor in her daily social life. These movies have similar narrative structures to the first, just in modern settings. This era started to converge with the previous as we return to Barbie playing a different character, now in modern films. These happen to be some of my favorites. I particularly loved The Princess and the Pop Star and Princess Charm School. Then Barbie shifts into a new era that feels a bit more safe than the previous eras, with Barbie playing Barbie, a girl from Malibu, living with her family and sisters. Barbie is still in many different settings, from foreign planets to a spy headquarters, but Barbie is always just Barbie. The best way I can describe this era is it's the sort of thing you'd expect from a Barbie movie, which in some ways feels disappointing after more imaginative movies that came before them. There are still some highlights to this era, particularly Big Cities, Big Dreams, which happens to be one of my favorite Barbie movies overall. The Barbie movies are finding a new footing, and it'll be interesting to see where they go from here. But an interesting thought I had while watching these movies was the common situation where media, when presented to a female audience, is often also presented as children's media. Somehow, female media also becomes children's media. Barbie, particularly, is so immersed in immediate visual femininity that makes stereotypical femininity appear indicative of youthfulness. Though, to be clear, this criticality is not directed at Barbie, as the IP has often been quite successful, but rather at female media as a broader concept. It seems peculiar that media subverting cultural representations of gender would fail to integrate different audiences within its female audience. To some degree, this may be done to set a better model for youth as to how gender can be seen in media, but as that audience grows old, media becomes more masculine. There's an interesting balance, however, as much female media is presented with youthfulness, but many other female-centric films are mature in content and marketed towards adult audiences. This is either through sexualized representations of femininity or the frequent R-rated female-led comedies, which, to be clear, I often do enjoy. But there's a glaring lack of female media in the gap between children's media and adults media. Greta Gerwig's Barbie movie was fascinating because it successfully found that gap, giving a female-centric movie in the PG-13 age rating. This movie was directed at a very wide audience within femininity, though in a way that was productive for male audiences as well. Barbie is a movie for women, but it's also a movie for girls, one that can productively be engaged with by men and boys, as long as they know their place within the audience. The movie is incredibly effective at finding this medium, and we can immediately see that there's an audience for that sort of media. Barbie is Warner Brothers' highest grossing movie of all time. Barbie seems to be guaranteed as the highest grossing movie of the year. To not see the need for regular, non-explicit, female-focused media accessible to an age range between children and adults as well as adults is negligent at this point. There's a demand for media to engage with this gender and age demographic, and one I fear that studios will somehow fail to recognize. Instead of female-driven, regular, non-children's media, you will see more toy movies. In another 10 years, another successful movie reaching the same audience will release, and we'll all of a sudden be shocked by how successful it is again. I watched every single Barbie movie, all 43 of them, and I regretted nothing. This has been a really worthwhile undertaking, and one that has helped me expand how I think about feminine media. This year was such a Barbie takeover, and I cannot express the joy of being a Barbie with the other Barbies in the theater. When I went to an early screening with my friend for the Barbie movie, there was an unparalleled joy and excitement, something I had never seen before in a movie theater. The audience had a sense of camaraderie through shared identity and experience, and celebrated this level of representation in media. I am optimistic for the future of female media, even though I'm concerned with how studios will reflect on Barbie's success. Ultimately, though, the validation and joy the audiences experienced in the Barbie movie is certainly something that can never be returned, never be concealed, and will become far more present in society.